In the marginalia of medieval manuscripts, the battle between knights and snails was a common scene. But what did it mean? In the blank spaces of illuminated manuscripts from the 13th and 14th centuries, medieval readers often left sketches and notes. These illuminated manuscripts were handwritten books adorned with stunning illustrations, often highlighted with gold and silver. While the text was embellished with ornate painted initials, the margins were frequently decorated with floral patterns, scribbled notes, doodles, or decorative drolleries. These whimsical images became a popular addition to illuminated manuscripts between the 13th and 15th centuries, serving as a space where artists could freely draw, offering both humorous relief and artistic critique of everyday life. Snails and knights were everywhere. Sometimes the knights were mounted, sometimes they were not. The snails could appear terrifying or insignificant. In some cases, the snail took up an entire page. In others, it was merely at the knight's feet. Typically, the knights were depicted as worried, stunned, or even shocked by their tiny adversary. While animals in medieval art were often used as symbols of specific virtues or vices, the strange thing here is that the small snail often had the upper hand, and no one knows exactly why. This has not stopped scholars, both past and present, from attempting to unravel the mystery of the knight and the snail. It seems that as early as 1850, the renowned book collector Count Bastard was the first to attempt to decipher this mystery. He linked the depiction of snails to the biblical story of resurrection. Another death-related interpretation comes from medieval scholar Lisa Spangenberg, who pointed to another biblical reference, Psalm 58. This passage speaks of the punishment of the wicked, stating that they shall melt away like a snail as it moves, and, like a stillborn child, they will never see the sun. This led to the suggestion that the valiant knights were battling the wicked, who would ultimately face their deserved fate. However, many have questioned this theory. As the British Library explains, it fails to account for why knights are so often depicted as the losers in these battles. It also does not explain why this particular motif became so popular in the margins of non-historical texts, such as psalters or books of hours. A similar interpretation proposes that the snail symbolizes the Lombards. Historian Lillian Randall suggested that these snails represented the Lombards, a Germanic people who ruled much of the Italian peninsula from 568 to 774 AD. By the time snail marginalia became frequent, around the 13th century, the Lombards were an unpopular group in Europe. They were perceived as monopolizing jobs, lending money at exorbitant interest rates, and, overall, as a deceitful, sinful people lacking chivalric virtue. Depicting them in the margins may have served as a form of xenophobic amusement, which could also explain why they were so often shown battling knights. Rather than portraying brave knights fighting wicked enemies like the Lombards, the theme of snails and knights may have been a humorous satire of the knightly class and the ideals of chivalry. In these illustrations, knights are often depicted as losing the fight or cowering in fear. Essentially, while knights claimed to be noble and courageous, they were only willing to fight weak opponents they knew they could defeat, ironically exposing their own cowardice. Some theories suggest that the imagery of knights and snails was a direct commentary on social class struggle. The knight symbolized the upper class, while the snail represented the impoverished masses. The poor had no weapons to fight against those above them. They were insignificant creatures struggling in a battle against those with better living conditions. However, arguments against this interpretation, and against the idea of satire, point out that it was precisely the upper class who commissioned these works. Would they really want to be reminded of the oppressed poor, or be mocked in the books they treasured? This has led to another theory, that the snail represents social climbers. Fear of social climbers, those who rose from humble origins and were elevated by the king, was evident in most medieval monarchies. When one's power depended on proximity to the king and the ability to influence him, those seen as upstarts, rising from nothing, posed a genuine threat to personal authority and influence. This might explain why so many scenes depict knights losing the battle, symbolizing the nobility's sense of powerlessness. Perhaps the most reasonable explanation, both for modern audiences and medieval ones, is that these illustrations were not meant to convey deep or meaningful messages, but were simply a form of entertainment, much like modern cartoons. Just as we view these images today with humor and curiosity, they may have served the same purpose 8 centuries ago. Many strange creatures and absurd images appear in manuscript margins, often unrelated to the texts they decorate. Perhaps the snail was just one of them. After all, the sight of a brave knight trembling in fear before a harmless snail is undeniably amusing. We may never know exactly why the image of the snail became so popular and widespread in medieval manuscripts. Snails crossed borders, appearing in manuscripts from France, England, and Flanders, and they persisted from the 12th to the 15th century. As a lasting symbol, their meaning may have shifted over time, taking on different interpretations across centuries and regions. It is possible that at various points, the snail represented all these ideas, and perhaps even more. What is certain is that centuries later, these images continue to entertain audiences around the world.